Welcome to another episode of Shift with Elena. God, I just wrapped up a conversation with Matt Gjertsen. He's the founder of Better Everyday Studios, where they provide different solutions for companies who are looking to, develop learning strategies, leadership development, and so on. So really, just kind of help your talent be at their best. But before that, he's held really high-level roles in SpaceX, where he was also doing learning and development. And then prior to that, he was in the Air Force. He was actually a pilot. And it was a really practical and useful conversation when we just talked about talent and development and practical things companies can do. We talked about leadership development as well and what you as a leader can do to be a better leader, essentially. Just super practical. So if you're in the space where the HR learning and development professional, this is definitely for you. Highly recommend. Like I'm in the space, and this was probably one of my most exciting guests when it comes to my industry. And then if you're an entrepreneur looking to start your own journey, I think there was also some key takeaways for you there in terms of like how do you actually recognize when it's time to go. So that was really useful as well. Anyway, check it out. It's super interesting, very engaging content. And as always, please subscribe, comment, share, and come back for more. Matt, welcome to the Shift Podcast.
Thank you so much, Elena. I'm excited to be here, excited to chat with you.
Yeah, likewise. You have a really exciting story. My listeners are going to be, ecstatic to have somebody with your background. Personally, I'm very excited because I love. I've found a lot of connection between starting your career and kind of the military space and having that experience, and then moving into the corporate space and entrepreneurship. So we're going to dive into some of those things. But take me back to you being in school. Take me back to you. High school, maybe entering college. What sparked the initial kind of start to your career?
It was always space. It was funny, and I think in middle school or growing up, I lived close to a little local airport, and me and my friends would always go up there and ride our bikes around the airport. And all my friends would say like, "Oh, hey, I want to be a pilot when I grow up." And I had to, of course, one up them, and they're saying, "I want to go fly planes." I said, "I want to fly the space shuttle." Uh, and so I've always been into space and science, and so that's what got me into flying. That's why I studied physics in college. So I've always been a space nerd. That's what
Yeah.
started it all for me.
That's very cool. That's very cool. I love it that because it's really rare that you meet somebody, at least in my case, that you meet somebody who was super passionate about something as a kid and then actually ended up you went into Air Force. So take me
Yeah.
to that's next. And then you actually studied physics. So like that's crazy. So talk me through that journey into your Air Force journey.
Yeah, the Air Force journey was a great one. It definitely laid the foundation for everything in my career. I mean, it really was, so if I want to be an astronaut, then I should be a pilot. What's the best way to be a pilot? Well, I'll probably go to the Air Force and the Air Force Academy. So I spent 4 years at the Air Force Academy. The whole, I mean, all the way up until, probably like 25, 26, I was just in a series of competitive situations where it's, first you're applying to college and trying to get into college, and then at the academy, you're competing because there's like a list of jobs that you can get out of the academy, and so they rack and stack all the academy graduates and then match you. First person gets their first choice, second person gets their first choice, but then eventually the choices run out, and so you're racked and stacked against all your peers there. And then I went to pilot training, and it was the same thing. You're racked and stacked against your peers to get the plane that you want. And then my first job as a pilot was as a first assignment instructor pilot. So that means I stayed in pilot training. And so again, at the end of that, my first flying job, I was racked and stacked against all my peers. And so I spent, a good 8 years just continuously in situations where I needed to perform relative to my peers in order to get what I wanted, which was kind. I mean, I guess everybody's kind of always in that position, but but there were these bottlenecks. So that kind of defined the first part of my professional life for sure.
Yeah. This just popped into my head, and just because I'm personally curious, and maybe somebody listening to this is, but what are the biggest misconceptions or myth people have around pilots and flying a plane? Can you like debunk anything for
Ooh.
us? Because
Oh, I don't know.
I don't think I ever talked to a pilot, and I mean, I fly a lot, so I'm always questioning, you know. But what are some
Yeah.
things that like or maybe you had walking into it, like a thought or like an assumption, and you're like, yeah, that's not what this is, or something.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things. One is, um, there's a lot of different kinds of flying for sure. And in fact, I actually chose, so my very first job after I graduated from the Air Force Academy, before I went to pilot training, was with an F-16 unit. So a fighter unit. And that year there convinced me I didn't want to be a fighter pilot, because fighter pilots spend, for an average flight is maybe an hour or 90 minutes, and they will spend 4 hours planning that flight and then 4 hours debriefing that flight. So like the
Very
ratio of
interesting.
flight time to like preparation and practice is like, I was like, that feels a bit intense to me. There were other reasons too, but that was one of them. And so then I went into I flew air refueling aircraft, so big aircraft. And so our average flights were 8 hours. The longest flight I did, I think, was 17 and a half or 18 hours. And whereas we're only planning that for a few hours and then debriefing that for a few hours. And so there's just much more flying time, but that flying time is very different. It's kind of is that true thing of like, 8 hours of boredom followed by 7 seconds of sheer terror or something. It's like
Is
a lot of flying is very just kind of like routine, but then there's
mhm.
key moments in a flight where it's like, oh, this is when my skills matter.
So air refuel. So what did you actually do? Is it one of those where you refuel in air?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh
So
my
there's
God.
this side of me back here behind me.
Yeah.
There's pictures of the KC-10, which I flew, and so our primary mission was refueling other aircraft. But then the KC-10 is what was unique. It's retired now, where it could be refueled as well. So we would go up, and we're flying. And so those are one of those critical moments where you imagine you're flying an aircraft that weighs 500,000 pounds, you're going 250 miles an hour, 25,000 feet above the ground, and you go touch another plane
Oh my God. New fear
while you're
unlocked.
flying. Yeah, so that was what I did.
That's very cool. I'm glad I asked that question. I didn't know the details of it, so that is super interesting.
Yeah,
Very, very cool. I could spend hours just asking you about that, but for the sake of my audience, we're gonna move
yeah,
on, and maybe I should do like a series of like a day in the life of a fighter pilot,
yeah.
a day in the
There you
life
go.
of air refuel. So we're gonna save it for
There you go.
another series
Yeah.
because I feel like that's where I should go. All right, so cool. So you did the Air Force, and then at what point did you decide to kind of move away, and then you went into SpaceX after that, or what
Yeah,
was that transition like?
exactly. Yeah, so when I left the Air Force, I knew I wanted to get closer to space, but I didn't know how. And so I just started kind of stalking people on LinkedIn who worked at SpaceX, who were Air Force veterans, and managed to connect with somebody. It's interesting. I never thought training was going to be the thing that I did. Like when you're in the military, or at least as a pilot, you always have two jobs. Like you're a pilot and you're something else, because and like a squadron in the Air Force, imagine an airline that's run by the pilots. And so like the squadron commander is also a pilot who's flying. The all the jobs that keep the squadron going are held by the pilots. So half the time you're flying and half the time you're doing your job. And that half the time when I was doing my job, the majority of the things that I did were as in various aspects of being a scheduler. So I was like figuring out what, matching crews to missions and figuring out which planes would fly where and who was ready to fly what. And so I thought I was going to get out and, be like a production scheduler or somebody that was, like a program management, that kind of stuff. But I connected with the launch director at one of SpaceX's launch sites, and he just said, "Well, we're looking for help with training. Have you ever done any training?" I'm like, "Well, I'm an instructor pilot. Sure, I can train people." And so that's how I found my way in. I mean, I like to say I kind of because I had left the Air Force before I found a job, and so I like to say I kind of jumped out of the plane and hoped I'd find a parachute on the way down, and it ended up working out. So that started my journey at SpaceX, and I was really I could have never imagined this world that I found of learning and development, and also how much the flying community, flying and the military really gave me a unique perspective on what I eventually did in learning and development, because I truly believe that the vast majority of people have no idea what real training is because they've never experienced it themselves. Unless you're in the military or you're a former professional athlete or something like that, you've probably never done really rigorous training. What you've done is education. And so when we
Mm.
think of learning and development, very often we think of education. And that's where we get these situations where we're dominated by classroom training, a person's upfront speaking to people. And I think most of the corporate world, learning and development looks much more like education. And that could be led by HR and L&D, or that's, I think, subject matter experts out in companies, that's their default because that's the only thing they know. They went to school, they know what school looks like. So when they need to train their people, they default to that. And so I think just the experiences that I had in the military really helped give me a different perspective that I brought to SpaceX and bring to other companies now of, let's train, let's not learn, let's train.
You know what? That's a really interesting perspective. I never thought about it, but it completely makes sense. Like as you, I was like, you are right. It is. I'm in a corporate training space. Like partially, I do a bunch of different things, but within the
Yeah.
corporate space. But yeah, like a training is a part of what I do. And that is so spot on. You're right. It is more, and that's probably why it doesn't stick most of the time
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's just that. So let's dive into that. So talk to me a little bit about how you see training, because I think that's gold. Like what you just said, I
Yeah.
think is just so valuable. So let's dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah. I think training is just much more. I mean, if you think about, especially contrasting like what school is versus what you need in the corporate workplace, like school is very divorced from outcomes typically and very big picture, right? They're because they have no knowledge. Most schools have very little understanding of what you're ever going to go do. So they're creating this like very non-specific functional skill set or knowledge set in your brain that it's then your job to go apply whenever you get out and go get a job. We're in the exact opposite situation in the corporate world, right? Like we know exactly what we want you to do. And so
Mm-hmm.
we need to take advantage of that. And I think the difference is when you think about training, it's very outcome oriented and behavior oriented. And the behavior piece is really what I key on the most because I think often outcomes are important, but they can sometimes be fuzzier. And if you talk to your typical subject matter expert about like what's the business outcome that you're trying to achieve with this, very often they can't say. But if you ask them the question, what behavior are you trying to change?
Mm-hmm.
That's a much more relevant question, I think, to your average stakeholder or to your
Yeah.
average subject matter expert. I want people, I need people to call this number when an emergency happens. I need managers to remember to think about this when they're looking at a resume or review a resume using this strategy. Those are behaviors that you can train. And so if we think about behaviors, then we can step back and be like, okay, well, how does the brain pick up any new behavior? How do we learn? How do we do things when we're out in the world? And really what it comes down to is, a lot of repetition, often emotional saliency where you have some like reason to want to do this. Those are the things you need to think about when you're designing training. How am I going to, because you're literally creating connections in the brain. And so you need to think about what are the things that I'm going to do in this training that are going to create that connection, because just telling somebody once isn't going to create a connection.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And again, I mean, I think like I like this behavior piece because that is super important because it's also digestible. Like I can
Yeah.
tell you what behaviors I want the
Yeah.
employee or the team to exhibit, but in terms of business, sometimes they don't even know.
Yeah.
Sometimes companies
100%.
or they can't share or they're not sure, et cetera. So I think that behavior piece is spot on. What you mentioned also, like when it comes to behavior change, there's also this like internal motivation, but then also external environment factor.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
talk to me about those, because I think that impacts, especially in the corporate world, right? Because most people don't want to be
Yeah.
there. Like half the time, they don't want to be in that training. I mean,
Yeah.
like, you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? So how do you tackle that?
Yeah, the environment plays in a ton. There's on the one hand, there's the environment that's either going to like support or inhibit this behavior that often isn't kind of within our remit of the training creation, right? What are the incentives that are placed on the workers, that kind of thing. Incentives are always going to win over any kind of training. If you're telling people that we want you to fill out this form, but you're giving them bonuses for some other form or whatever it is, like they're going to do the other thing. So that's really important, but often not something that we can directly tackle in training creation. But the things about the environment that we can tackle is making sure we're thinking about the environment, or as I often say, the context within which these behaviors are happening, because that's what's going to trigger all of these behaviors. Like in Atomic Habits, they use the term the cue for habits, right? Every habit starts with some environmental cue of I'm going to pick up the cigarette, or I'm going to have a drink, or I'm going to, put on my shoes and go for a run. And so I think the thing that we often do is we take, in my world where I'm talking with, manufacturing supervisors, they're out on a shop floor that's super loud and noisy, everybody's yelling at one another. We take them out of that environment. We put them in a temperature controlled, quiet classroom, teach them how to give feedback, and then wonder why when they go back out on the factory floor they don't remember any of the things that we taught them, was because there's no environmental cues for them to trigger that knowledge, because your brain, it's really hard to remember things, it's really hard to process information, and so your brain has created all these shortcuts, and picking up on the environment around you to decide this is what's important now, these are the things I need to remember, are one of those shortcuts. And so thinking about what that environment is, and then that can also play into the language that you use in the training, the kinds of examples that you use. That's always the challenge with off the shelf content, is things are just different. Like the examples that they use to explain a concept don't apply to the people that are taking the training, or may not perfectly apply, and so the information just goes one in one ear out the other.
I like the point about just, yeah, you're right. Like you're taking people out of the completely different environments and then you put them back. So it's like almost like you isolated them in this
Yeah.
area and then you expect them to apply this change, which doesn't make sense. So I like that because I think a lot of times you see a very generic, out of the box kind of training programs, and they apply it across board to all departments, all the people, all the levels, and it doesn't work, right? And
Yeah.
I'm happy to see like companies are doing different things and stuff like that. Have you also noticed the shift in L&D from, I feel like before it was like, we're executors. Like people just come in and say, we need you to train, versus
Yeah.
now it seems like people come to you with a problem and say, we're having this problem. And you almost have to put on these consultant hats versus just,
Yes.
here's a bunch of content that nobody's going to watch or read.
Yeah.
What have
Yeah.
you seen in that shift?
That is definitely the shift that everybody wants and that should be happening. And I think and if it's not in your organization, you need to figure out how you can encourage it, because it's really critical. A good friend of mine who was a learning development and culture leader inside the Virgin Group, he always said that his as the head of learning and development, his number one job was convincing people that that problem doesn't require learning.
Yeah.
Right, that people would come, because it usually doesn't, there's this hierarchy that I often use when I'm talking to people, where when somebody comes and says like, hey, we need training, you say like, well, first you say, how many people are having this problem? Because very
Hmm.
often, like, one person made a mistake and now it's a
Yeah.
training problem, when it's like, no, 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 like that's a personnel management problem, right? And then the next question you might ask is this behavior or process documented? Like, does anybody know what good looks like? Do they have the resources to follow that documentation? Are they getting feedback when they're doing things incorrectly? There's all these interventions that you can run prior to ever deciding that training is going to matter. And if we don't do that, you're just spinning your wheels. You wind up not really being effective and not seen as a true partner in pushing change within the organization.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. It's like you almost have to come back with like questions. Like I'm
Yep.
laughing because this happens so often. Like
Yeah.
I had a company one time, a big company, and they came and they were like they wanted to introduce like a new culture or something like that, and they had not a culture, sorry, it was values. So they had these
Okay.
5 values, and one of the
Yeah.
values was like ownership or something. And so they
Yeah.
reached out and they're like, we have these 5 values. Can you do like a 45-minute presentation about ownership? And like they were thinking that this will solve, like people will just embody
Yeah.
it, and I'm just like, and I pushed back, and I end up not doing anything with them because I don't, I think they just wanted somebody to come in and literally do, and I was like,
Check the box.
take the box. And I was
Yeah.
just like, and I was like, this is so ridiculous. Like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
And then you go into this dilemma as a professional, especially if you're starting off like I was at that time, and you're like, okay, do I just take the money and just shut up?
Yeah.
But it's like, it's your reputation. Like, you're not gonna add any value to these people. Maybe they'll be inspired a little bit, but that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is true internally as well. I think there's a few things. One thing that I always try to remind people of is there's not a shortage of problems in companies, right? Like like every company on the inside, you pick the most well-run company you've ever heard of. I
Mhm.
guarantee you from the inside, it's a dumpster fire, right? Like there's
Yeah.
there's no limit to problems. So saying no to the problems that aren't related to training doesn't mean you're not going to have a job, right? There's still going to be plenty of problems for you to solve. So that's one just reminder of like, remember, there's plenty of things for you to do. But I think the harder thing is, yeah, people come to you and maybe because like we're just trying to make this shift within organizations. They've been trained in companies before where L&D is more of the order taker or does have more of a just like push learning out there mentality. And it is a challenge to, especially if maybe you're new at the job or something, it takes a long time to shift that mentality, and it's all about developing relationships. And I actually often say, when, because I think on LinkedIn all the time people pose this question, how do you stop being an order taker? And one of my first answers is start by being a good order taker, right? I don't think, you and I as consultants, we can choose whether or not to work with a client. And if somebody comes to us and has this crazy thing, we can be like, I know this isn't going to work, so I don't think we should do this.
Mm.
You don't necessarily have that option in a company. And so I think it is about probably the first time a stakeholder comes to you and they say, hey, I need you to create this, is when you have no relationship and no trust. If you immediately start launching into this detailed analysis where it sounds like you're questioning their ability to understand their own team and do they really get what the needs are, it's not a great way to start a relationship very often. And so I think it can be really important to start by, great, like, let's do this. And then over time, as you build that relationship, start to softly question things. Hey, what if we tried it this way? What if we did a different thing? I'm not sure this will work. Could I try this different intervention? And so
Mm.
it really is all about relationship management and building those relationships over time.
Yeah, I think that's a solid point as well. Like, I'm just like thinking back to my career. I'm like, yeah, for sure. Like, I think it's just building that trust, that credibility
Yeah.
internally, just as you
Yeah.
would externally, essentially, in many cases.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about leadership development because that's a big topic. And
Yeah.
I'm curious from your perspective, do you think leaders can be developed? Like, do you think that skill can be developed? Like, I'm talking about, I'm not talking about managers, I'm talking about leadership, like true leadership.
Ooh, there's so many avenues, so many different ways I want to take this. Because I do think so. One, yes, I 100% do. A phrase I often use because I do think we think a lot about, and you can parse these phrases differently, but I'll just say hard skills and soft skills, and like
Hmm.
people, you say that, and people generally know what you're talking about. And to me, the only difference between hard skills and soft skills is we haven't thought about the soft skills enough to make them hard. I 100% do think anything you say in the leadership or people skills realm it does still boil down to very clear behaviors. Now, the right behavior is extremely situational, and extremely contextual, and it varies for every company and every person. Who you are, how you lead, who they are, how they want to be led, makes it very complicated, but it
Mm,
still does come down to something that I am doing, an action that I am taking or a thing that I am saying. So I think we can, if we think about it enough, boil it down to very specific behaviors. The other thing you mentioned about like kind of the difference between management and leadership, for me personally, I really just think of those things as one is a position and one is an action, right? Like management is, I don't necessarily subscribe to the philosophy of like, you manage your bank account, you lead people. Like, sure, that's true, but I think of it more as in the context of what we're talking about. Management is like a position that you are given, so you
mm,
have some kind of authority, whereas leadership is something that anybody can have. But if you take kind of leadership and you break it down, I think actually here let's do this. Um, what are some examples of like when you say leadership, like what's a quality that comes to mind? And let's
mm.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this on the spot, but let's just try. Let's like
We'll
take the
try.
most like out there big picture idea of leadership, and we can work together and see if we can distill it down to a couple actions.
Yeah, let's do it. So I think somebody who is able to, let's say, future-proof the business, like leading on
Mm,
future-proofing like thinking about the business, like because I feel like that's what a lot of companies miss is like everybody's just so executing. They're not
yes.
thinking about like how we're future-proofing. I think that's part of leadership because like how are you making sure your people have jobs in the future? How do you make sure to at least do your best? Your
Yeah.
product still
Yeah.
survives, evolves, blah blah blah.
Yeah. So what do you think are what are some of the barriers to that? Why aren't individual leaders? Because what I hear you saying is thinking about leaders are too focused on the today and they're not thinking about the tomorrow.
Mhm.
What are some of the why aren't they thinking about the tomorrow? What's keeping them from doing that?
Oh, I love this. So fun. Okay, so I think a part of it is could be um, a couple of things. So it could be a founder's mindset, which what I mean by that is hogging all the information, and they might not
Mm-hmm.
have the time, but they don't want to
Mm-hmm.
delegate. So like they're so stuck on
Yep.
like I need to lead on this, etc. So there's this like
Yep.
founder's mindset slash lack of delegation, lack of identifying the right people to lead on that initiative because you don't need to do it
Yep.
yourself, but
Yep.
you need to make sure somebody's thinking about it. So I think that's
Yep.
one. The other
Let's
one,
stop there because
let's start there. Yeah.
let's go with that one because yeah, because like I said, the reason why like the big difference between hard skills and soft skills is the complexity of these, and so you can keep like branching out almost
Yeah.
forever. But I
Sure.
heard there was two different things I heard in there is communication, like hogging the knowledge and being open, and then that delegation piece with I work with engineers all the time, and I think especially for new engineers, like that's the number one challenge they have. They're used to being the one with the solution and they want to be the one with the solution.
Mm,
And so we can take one of those delegation, so now we're getting, because I agree with you. I think the number one thing that keeps people from thinking about tomorrow is they're just too busy. And so they need to get some things off their plate. And so we can now start to break down delegation. Okay, like how do I start delegating? And again, this is going to be very situational and what that company wants to do and how they want to do it. But you can start to imagine some interventions of, okay, so what I want to do is I want to get you to look at your calendar, all the meetings that you're in, and I just want you to pick one a week that you're not going to go to. Like, what's one meeting that you don't need to be the decision maker, that you're not adding in there, and and you're gonna get out of that and then and see what happens and see if it's okay. So you can
mm,
boil it so and I get it. This is an extremely small thing when you're thinking about how do you future proof the business, but it's like if you can distill it down to that now, oh, I can figure out an intervention to do this, right?
yeah.
Of what training might look like to get my leaders to each week pick one meeting that they're not going to go to and see what happens, and the world doesn't end. So the next week they pick two meetings, and as
Mm-hmm.
a way to slowly get them to change their behavior and start, because I think especially with that delegation piece, it really comes down to very often the delegation of decision authority. That's really what people have a hard time in. They think they need to be the one in the room saying yes or no to things. And if we can just train them to slowly let go of that responsibility, that's how they then get the time to think about tomorrow and thus future-proof the business.
Yeah, no, I think it's super practical, and I think, and you know what, the thing with letting go, I think it's just people, it's such a simple step, and it's just people want to avoid that because it's uncomfortable, so they try to focus on like a bunch of other things that don't
Yeah,
matter. Versus you could just
yeah,
look at your calendar and not attend a meeting that you probably don't need to be a part of anyway.
yeah,
So it is. So I think it's solid. Like it's so actionable, and it's anybody who's
yeah,
listening to this, because people always say, "Oh, I'm too busy." Stop right there.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
stop it.
It's
Yeah.
funny. Because I'm working on a book right now, and I was thinking about there's a section on delegation, and I was relating it back to my time as a pilot. Because as an instructor pilot, really what you're doing the entire time you're teaching somebody how to fly is delegating authority to fly the plane to your
Mm.
student slowly over time, right? And you're like delegating more and more authority. And when you're an instructor pilot, we often talked about this like comfort bubble that you would have of how far am I going to let a student go before I correct them? And as you become more experienced as an instructor, you feel more confident in your ability to get a situation back under control. And so you let the student go farther and farther and farther. That's like this increasing in this comfort bubble as you let them go farther and farther because because that's how they learn, right? They need to be the ones to fix the situation if you want them to learn. And then what ultimately happens, your the life cycle of being an instructor is your bubble grows and grows and grows, and then it gets too big, you get into a scary situation and you contract it back down because
Yeah.
you let them go beyond your skill set. And then again over time you get comfortable and you get more skilled, so it grows and grows, and it's just kind of this
Hmm.
increasing like, and I think you can take that to that delegation piece is you start to can't you don't go to this meeting, you don't go to this meeting, you don't answer, you take yourself off of this email chain. Eventually something's going to go wrong, and you could have made the difference, and you should have been in that meeting, and maybe you decided to delegate something that you shouldn't have. That's not a signal that you just get stop delegating. It's like, oh, okay,
Hmm.
let's rein it in a little bit, let's train up my folks a little bit more, and then let's try this again. I because like a lesson that from my SpaceX days, and Elon Musk always talks about this idea of the best part is no part. Like you're always trying to simplify and get rid of things and get rid of rules and get rid of requirements. And the only way to know that you're getting rid of enough is if you're adding back in 10% of what you got rid of.
Mm.
Right? That's how you know you're pushing it. If you're never having to add something back in, then you're not being aggressive enough. And I think, depending on the situation and the criticality of it, that can be applied to delegation. If you're not periodically being like, oh, maybe I should have made that decision, uh, then you're probably not delegating enough.
Yeah, yeah, and in your case, it was life and death. In most cases,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you
yeah,
delegate, you will
yeah,
be okay. Like no,
yeah,
nobody's gonna die in most cases. Like worst thing, a client might be pissed off, or that's worst case scenario, right? So I think the
yeah.
solution I've just come up with: everybody should go into the military before they go into.
Ah,
Everybody should go do some kind of military training where it's literally life and death. Choose your military branch. Air Force is one option. But no, but in all jokes aside, like it's I think that's what it is. I think the fear in the mind of a leader is much bigger than it actually is. And it's like, what's the worst that will happen? Okay, we'll start with baby steps delegation. Like you don't need to delegate an
yeah,
important contract closing or like proposal something that's going to
yeah,
cost your
yeah,
company millions, right? Like it's like, what is the small thing? And also part of it to me, that's all. The other piece of leadership is let your people fail so that you can be there to
yeah,
correct and address
yeah,
and because that's leadership, is making other
yeah.
leaders. That's what leadership is to me as well. It's like, how do you make sure that you are building people up behind you, right, coming up behind you?
Yeah.
So yeah.
100%. And you use the word fear, and I think it's important to recognize that the fear is legitimate, right? Because like the other thing with leadership is, you how's the phrase go? You don't get credit for the wins, but you take responsibility for the losses, right? When things go
Mm-hmm.
well, you give the credit to your team. When things go
Yes.
wrong, it is your fault. Like so the fear of being blamed for mistakes is real, but you just have to get over it. Like that, like you
Yes.
just have to.
Yeah, I love it. I love that saying. It's one of my favorite. Um, Speaking of fear and scary things, starting a business, going in entrepreneurship can be scary as well. So at what point you're like, I'm ready to launch and jump off yet another plane on my own and build something on
Yeah.
the way down. So, or maybe you did, maybe you had a better plan. But tell me a little bit
Yeah.
more about that.
Yeah, it really, so it came from two things. One, it definitely, the business started out of COVID, like many did, where I'm working from home and had some folks, former colleagues, reach out to me with some help building some training. And because building training is something that's very easy to do as kinds of a nights and weekends side hustle, I started doing that. And that just kind of grew and grew and grew until I went part time in my full time role, and eventually left my full time role and just totally went out on my own. Uh, Bigger picture, like the deeper reasoning for it is, I think really what it was is I had like a series of what most people would say were dream jobs, right? I wanted to be a pilot. I became a pilot. I wanted to work at SpaceX. I worked at SpaceX. I got recruited out of SpaceX to help to build a learning team at a fast growing startup. Like these were all signals that my career is 100% going in exactly the right direction. And yet, at every juncture, I was having existential crises. Like I'm having panic attacks in the office. I'm having outbursts of anger for no reason. I'm just like these were not good things. So externally, everything looks like it's going great, but internally, it wasn't. And through a lot of thinking through that, it really realized it was all about kind of my values and what I wanted out of my life. And really, what I valued most in life is freedom of action, like the ability to make decisions about the direction that I think things should be going or how things should be done. And if that's your number one value, I don't know if you have a lot of options other than running your own business because you just don't get the option to do that inside a company very often. And so I loved what I was doing. I love building cultures, but I'm building somebody else's culture, right? Whereas
Mhm.
now I get the opportunity. I mean, obviously, I'm still helping other people build their culture, but within the
Yeah.
context of I'm figuring out what's the culture going to be at Better Everyday Studios as we grow.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's I don't know if it's I don't know what it was that shifted. I guess COVID is a big part of that. Maybe we finally had some time to be like, what do we actually value and so on,
Yeah.
as human beings. Because I think this piece of self-awareness is and values, I think, is lacking. At least like when I do some of my coaching sessions, I'm surprised how often people not sure about what their values are. Like it takes time to
Hmm.
really think through it. And I think it's so important to understand your deal breakers, your values. Yeah, it's astonishing.
You'll love this story. So it was the last day in my last job. So it was literally the right as I was getting ready to leave and go fully out on my own. And and the team was adding a few new members to the team. So we were having like a team building session. It was just ironic that it was one of my last days there. But where we talk about like what's the mission of the team and get to know each other and that kind of stuff. And we were going through this situation of trying to do this exercise of identifying values, and we're writing down what's one word or phrase of your top five values. Okay, now narrow it down. Okay, now narrow it down again. And I think it was when we were getting ready to put up, okay, like what's your number one value? And I'm looking at the things I had written down, and I put up on the board security because I thought that was my number one value. And I'm sitting here doing this as I'm getting ready to leave a great salaried role to
Hmm.
start my own company. And
Hmm.
I reflect back, it's like, okay, so I went from working for the US government, which is one of the most secure jobs you could
Yeah.
possibly have, to working for a 7,000 person company, to working to a 500-person startup, to working for myself. There's no way I value security as like my
Hmm.
number one thing. And so it was just that literally that it was that moment. I was like, oh, this I can't. And I took it off the board and put something else up because like that's just not what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, listen, it's I think it's like a continuous thing. And I'm not sure yet. I don't have a fam like I haven't I'm not a mom yet. So I wonder if those values change as you evolve as a human, whether you become a parent or a spouse or like what I'm saying. I'm sure values change with that's just my assumption, right? Because for me they definitely changed from like my 20s into my 30s, right? And like now
Hmm.
being in my late 30s, like I can see how they'll probably evolve. And that's why it's
Hmm.
like a continuous thing, right? And so maybe
Yeah.
security was important for you when you were 20, right? Or something, like going into the military. But yeah, do you think they change over time? Like, do you think some of them are like like maybe core ones stay, but then others change? I don't know.
It's interesting because I'm not sure if they do. I
Mm,
think they. I was actually at an event with Susie Welch, who just put out a book about values,
mm-hmm.
and I asked, and somebody asked her this question: do your values change? And she actually thinks that they don't. And as I reflect, at least on my story, because I have no idea for other people, but I think it's our understanding of them change, but maybe the actual values don't. Because though for all those years I was saying security was my number one value, I was also really unhappy for all of those years, right?
Mm,
Right? There wasn't a match there, and so I can look at my childhood and I know exactly where my thought that I valued security came from. I know exactly where it came from,
mm-hmm,
um, but I don't think it actually was true during all of
mm,
that time. I thought it was, but I don't think it was. And so I'm not sure if they actually change, but how we understand them changes, and whether or not we are choosing to live them or not changes. Because there are like, I mean, I say freedom of action is like my number one value, but I also clearly having a kid or being married, like those are all things that are going to inhibit your freedom of action, but those
yeah,
were obviously very important to me too, because I did both
yeah.
those things. So we're all always choosing to weight these different values against one another.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. What's that book? Do you know? Is it just called Values? Susan Welsh? Do you know off the top of your head?
No. Oh, I have it right here. Hold on.
All right.
It's Becoming You by Susie
Becoming
Welch.
You. Nice. We're
And
gonna look
she
it up
actually has
as
a her website has a really great quiz on it to identify your values. And
oh,
I mean, something like more than 35,000 or 40,000 people have taken it. So it's like a really robust data set that they're starting to build. So yeah, highly recommend that people look it up.
yeah. We'll check it out for sure. Very, very cool. Anything else that you wanted to make sure we chat about today? Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of different things that's been super practical and lots of great takeaways. But is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap this up and you tell us where we can find you?
No, I don't think so. I think this has been a great discussion. I think we've covered a lot of stuff. It's been wide ranging, but I feel like there's been like you said, a good practical thread through it. So
Yeah.
no, I think it's been great.
Awesome. Well, where can people find you? Where they can get in touch with you around Better Everyday Studios or your
Yeah.
LinkedIn profile, maybe?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is definitely the number one place to find me. I'm very active there. I post just about every day. So I love to connect with everybody there. And then, yeah, bettereverydaystudios.com is where you can find out more about what we're doing. So, yeah, if you are someone, whether you're the leader of a team, you're in HR, you're in L&D, if you're looking to get help and support kind of building programs to help develop leaders, develop employees, and some of these people skills that are often harder to define, uh, love to chat with you and see if we can help.
Perfect. Well, Matt, thank you so much. It's been a really soulful discussion for me.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic.